smartness, and both, I think, some of the sort of more positive hopes that people had when this paradigm was introduced, and also some of the current, perhaps negative repercussions, which I would let Ines deal with. So I'll try to be brief. So effectively, smart cities as a paradigm comes from the 1960s and 1970s in the United States. During the 1960s in the United States, you had particularly after the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and after the assassination of Martin Luther King, who was a kind of civil rights leader of the African American community, there were large-scale riots in most American cities. These were very large riots, primarily coming from the African American community, primarily targeting sort of the power infrastructure, the power structures, the police, and the urban core. And these riots were of such large extent that in almost every major American city, Newark, New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, that the center of the city was literally kind of burnt. It was destroyed. This led to two phenomena. One phenomenon, which is well known in urban studies in the United States, is called the phenomenon of what is called white flight, where the Caucasian American residents, often more wealthy, fled the center of the city to the suburbs, to the outskirts of the city. So that's why in the United States, unlike, say, Europe, you have this unique urban configuration where the wealth is usually in a ring around the city, and the city is often primarily African American, and until recently fairly economically depressed. For the last 10 to 20 years, this has been reversing, with more young, white, hip people moving into the African American part of town and displacing those residents. Now, what is not so well known is that in one of the reactions to this wave of riots was what was called the Community Agency Bureau in Los Angeles, which said, well, we can help fix if we have these large-scale urban riots, we can fix these riots, we can prevent them from happening in the future, and we can regenerate the city. And the way we do this is via what was not really called big data at the time, but what was sort of early data-intensive techniques. So these intensive techniques, which at the time were not particularly intrusive, but just involved sort of doing as much data capture about who owned what and who lived where and what the economics of the city were, and then cooperating with the local police department and to predict when the next riot would happen and ideally prevent it from happening. And in academia, this was although the techniques were sort of pioneered in Los Angeles, the actual sort of academic background was pioneered at MIT and what eventually became the Media Lab, but which was originally the Architecture Machines Group, led by someone called Nicolas Negroponte, who working very intensely with both private donors and the U.S. military, tried to develop these sort of techniques for what eventually really became known as a smart city. And it was a convergence of a change in computing infrastructure where, originally in the 1960s, and both in, obviously, Russia and the United States, computers were these sort of large devices. These are the mainframes that were kept in separate rooms. Then somewhere in between the 80s, these became more the personal computer, the laptop, which we still have today, and to some extent the smartphone. But what actually, at the time, various for any philosophers in the audience, what was noticed was that this ability, the personal computer was still very attention-grabbing. It wasn't very portable. It took up all of your attention and was very heavy. You only had one, very individual. And Mark Weiser, a student who had read Heidegger, among other philosophers, and who studied at Xerox PARC, imagined a third wave of computing, which he called ubiquitous computing. And so ubiquitous computing involved the placement of sensors, which were very small computing devices throughout the environment, so that computing would fall into the background of our everyday existence. It would be, to use a Heideggerian terminology, it would be Zuhandenheit. It would be ready at hand. So your intelligence, your cognitive capabilities would be simply extended into the environment effortlessly. And Mark Weiser said the problem with computers, which he's dead now, but he would probably include smartphones in this critique, is that these computing technologies took your attention away. And against them, because it needs to optimize them. It needs to make them into better people who eat better, maybe eat vegetarian food, or pollute less, or nicer to each other. And while this seems, I think, a very compelling vision, that why wouldn't one want to stop climate change, why wouldn't one want to be more wealthy, there is there's a danger that these technologies lead to the elimination of people that do not fit within their optimizing framework. And that is ultimately why smart cities do cut populations. And what we're seeing now, I think, globally, is the revolt of the dumb people. So you have the United States, you have Trump, Brazil, I forget his name, but that fellow just won the election. And I assume this will continue throughout the world as people feel like they are not part of the decision-making process around these smart technologies. It's interesting, they're not called intelligent, they're not called clever. I don't know what the translation in Russian is, but in English, smart is a very interesting word. It's not a Latin word, it has nothing to do with the intellect, with the nous. What smart is a German word, comes from smorten or schmiersen. And schmiersen in German, for anyone who speaks German, actually means a bit like to hurt. So you say if someone hurt you, say, oh, I'm smarting, or I smarted myself. And at some point, this term smart transformed from being a word that hurt someone into a word that meant a word for being in pain, really, into a positive word. And this transition is because smart also has a lesser known meaning, which is German as well, which is to cut. It's really interesting right now, because I think there is a lot of Russian-phobia right now in the US press. I think this is not reflective of the general population. So what happened in 2016 elections is the kind of...
Do you personally believe in interference and stuff, in the Russian trolls?
Well, I'm sure there's some interference, but every state interferes with everyone else, so why would there not be any interference? The United States destroyed Russia's economy completely, and whatever. Sins overthrows governments and murders people on a regular basis, so a few Facebook ads, probably not a big deal. I think what actually happened in the United States is that historically the people in power in the U.S. have the government, the NSA, these sort of groups, which are tightly, what in the United States was called by Eisenhower the military-industrial complex, really do have a classical liberal ideology. They are classically into markets, and they are classically fans of technology, and these are the same sorts of, to be nice people that work at MIT, smart people, but this led in the United States to massive wealth inequalities. Real wages have been stagnant since the 1970s. Large percent of the population, which is not black and Latino people voted in not surprisingly high numbers for Trump. And that these people felt very alienated, particularly I think a lot of white people felt very alienated who were not part of this new elite, and they recognize that they are not part of this elite. And I think this is where Trump's basis comes from, and this is why I say the revolt of the dumb people. But dumb may not be an insult, right? Dumb may mean that they are on some level authentic,
Like
that they
conservative.
are, whatever. They just
Right.
don't fit into this particular model of what it means to be human in the 21st century, and that's most of humanity. And I don't think these people, which are the majority of the population, believe in Russian interference. They probably don't care. They seem to vote for Trump regardless. And I think that my prediction would be that unless there is some sort of swing to the far left or swing to the far right in American politics, I would be not surprised if Trump would win again. And what Trump winning again, and Bolsonaro winning, and Movement 5 Stars winning, and Mélenchon. I mean, in France you have Mélenchon, who's both far left, and Le Pen, far right, both being very popular. You're seeing a kind of global revolt against neoliberalism, and the liberals believe that they're doing things for the good of people, but the people do not agree. I mean, maybe they can't articulate it very well. Maybe they vote crazy ways. Maybe they believe strange things. Maybe they murder each other. I mean, it's a mess. I'm not going to say it's something that anyone should look forward to, but it's not. I think there is a dialectical logic to the creation of these technologies in the 60s and 70s, their attempt to control the population, and this just not working very well in the last few years.